My topic is Christians under Hitler. Hitler died 76 years ago, so you may wonder why I've chosen to talk about the Hitler era. I'll begin by telling you 7 things Hitler did and give you similar examples from Malaysia. I'll tell you about 3 Christian pastors, Bonhoeffer, Niemoller, and Wachsmann, 2 of whom the Nazis murdered. I'll tell you how German and South African churches use something called status confessionis to overcome race-based policies, which are really policies of injustice. And I'll tell you why all this matters. So let's begin. Hitler turned the German parliament into a mere rubber stamp for his orders. This is so like the emergency proclamation in Malaysia, with parliament suspended for 8 months and every government MP given some powerful, well-paid position so that he or she won't be able to do the work of holding the government accountable. Number 2, Hitler established a private army, the stormtroopers, who are also known as brown shirts, to force people into submission. This is so like the nexus in Malaysia between UMNO and gangsters and Rela. And it's not just UMNO, some other parties do this too. Moving on to the 3rd point, Hitler eliminated his opponents using both legal and illegal means. The Night of the Long Knives carried out by the Gestapo, in which hundreds died, is perhaps the best known example. In Malaysia, we know of abductions conducted by the police and by immigration officers, and they use SOSMA on people whom they consider political pawns or threats. When so many politicians commit or cover up crimes, we shouldn't be surprised at these things. 4, Hitler annexed neighboring countries, beginning with Austria, and went to war. War talk is, sadly, often popular. In Malaysia, it often feels like every Malay Muslim politician wakes up each day hoping to join a march against Israel and make a speech to claim that all Israelis hate all Palestinians. 5, Hitler eliminated Jews. He told all kinds of false stories about them, instigated the final solution, and murdered over 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. In Malaysia, politicians often speak in ways which dehumanize migrant workers and refugees, and often they tell false stories about proselytizing by Christians. Moving on to 6, Hitler appointed his man, Ludwig Müller, Bishop of the Reich or German Church, which gladly danced to Hitler's tune. In Malaysia, state religious departments constantly declare what Muslims must believe and insist that members of one ethnic group cannot choose their religious faith. 7, Hitler made himself dictator, and the people treated him as if he could do no wrong, though he acted very unjustly. In Malaysia, we have the culture of bosku, malu apa. Our former Prime Minister, Najib, though found guilty by a court of law, still has immense support and may win many votes in the next election. Now I want to move on to talk about Germany. In 2008, the year when the ruling coalition, Barisan Nasional, lost its 2/3 majority for the first time, the wallpaper on my phone was a photo of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer, a brilliant scholar, author, and much-loved pastor. The Nazis executed him for his role in a plot to assassinate Hitler. They hanged him to death when he was 39 years old, after they had held him in prisons for 2 years. Bonhoeffer was then, and is now, the best-known voice of the confessing church, the Protestant churches which oppose Hitler and the Reich or German churches. A paragraph Bonhoeffer wrote while in prison has inspired many over the decades and is still regularly quoted. It reads, "We have all been silent witnesses of evil deeds. We have been drenched by many storms. We have learned the arts of equivocation and pretense. Experience has made us suspicious of others and kept us from being truthful and open. Intolerable conflicts have worn us down and made us cynical. Are we still of any use? What we shall need is not geniuses or cynics or clever tacticians, but plain, honest, and straightforward men. Will our inward power of resistance be strong enough, and our honesty with ourselves remorseless enough for us to find our way back to simplicity and straightforwardness? German Christians learned well from their nightmare under Hitler. Many South African Christians have also learned well from the German nightmare. They have much to teach us. After about 10 years of writing, speaking, and organizing for justice, during which time I was a faithful Bible reader and church attender, I felt a need for deep thinking about politics and the Christian. So I began reading about politics, Christian faith, and models of public obedience. I learned a lot, but I felt I needed to think together with others. So a couple of months ago, I joined a master's level course in public theology taught by Mr. Philip Cole, whom some of you may know. He taught the course under the auspices of Seminary Theology Malaysia, but he's a senior lawyer, still practicing in Malaysia. Over 4 decades, he's handled many cases involving freedom of religion and parliamentary processes. He played a pivotal role in the cases of Raymond Koh Amrichemat and Joshua Hilmi and Ruth Sitepu. Somehow he also finds time to be an adjunct professor in University Malaya. Philip introduced me to the concept of status confessionis and its importance. Status confessionis denotes something which is central to the gospel. Lutherans first used it in 1577 in a document called the Formula of Concord. The term is used to designate the opposite or antithesis of what's called adiaphora, things which don't make a difference to salvation. For example, displaying carvings, paintings, and statues in homes or churches. I learned that Bonhoeffer resurrected the idea of status confessionis when in 1933, he, together with another pastor theologian, Professor Herman Sasse, drafted a confession of faith, which came to be known as the Bethel Confession. Some of you may have heard about it. In case you're wondering, a confession of faith is a carefully worded pronouncement of what we believe, and therefore a strong statement about what we reject. For example, when I assert that Jesus died on the cross, I reject any claim that Jesus did not die on the cross. A committee reviewed the Bethel Confession. The committee amended it so much that Bonhoeffer said he could no longer recognize it, and it was never published officially. At issue was a Nazi policy laid out in what became known as the Aryan paragraph. According to this policy, even baptized Christian Jews could not be church members, let alone pastors, so they all had to resign. Bonhoeffer held that this flies in the face of Ephesians chapter 2, verse 14. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. Bonhoeffer concluded that a church that accepted the Aryan paragraph in its own life would cease to be the Church of Christ. One could serve such a pseudo-church only by leaving it. Rejecting the Aryan paragraph is the status confessionis. Now, the non-publication of the Bethel Confession doesn't matter, because another confession was drafted and eventually issued. The drafting was mostly by the Swiss theologian Karl Barth, who was then teaching in Germany. It's known as the Barmen Declaration. Bonhoeffer adopted it and worked hard to propagate it. I'll read you the first sentence and you'll see why it made the Nazi Christians so angry. In view of the errors of the German Christians and of the present Reich Church administration, which are ravaging the church and at the same time also shattering the unity of the German evangelical church, we confess the following evangelical truths. Very strong. The website from which I extracted that quotation has some text which helps readers like us better understand why the Barmen Declaration was produced. I'll read some of it. The 1934 Barmen Declaration was a call to resistance against the theological claims of the Nazi state. Almost immediately after the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, Protestant Christians faced pressure to Aryanize the church, expel Jewish Christians from the ordained ministry, and adopt the Nazi Führer principle as the organizing principle of church government. In general, the churches succumbed to these pressures, and many Christians embraced them willingly. The pro-Nazi German Christian movement became a force in the church. They glorified Adolf Hitler as a German prophet and preached that racial consciousness was a source of revelation alongside the Bible. But some Christians opposed the encroachment of Nazi ideology on the church's proclamation. This emerging confessing church adopted a declaration which expressly repudiated the claim that other powers apart from Christ could be sources of God's revelation. Anyone who supported the Barmen Declaration was declared an enemy of the state. Thousands of pastors and Christians were arrested, tortured, prosecuted, jailed for long periods, and often killed on account of their support of the Barmen Declaration. The Declaration explicitly rejected the following false doctrines. Rejected that we can proclaim anything not contained in the Word of God. Rejected that any part of our life is not under God. Rejected that the church has permission to adapt to prevailing political or ideological ideas. Rejected that the church can have the Führer as chief. Rejected that the state can be the sole authority which orders life. Rejected that the church can replace the state. Rejected that we can follow our own desires. Earlier, I spoke briefly about Bonhoeffer. Now I'll tell you about two other Protestant pastors who served Christ and his church by supporting the Barmen Declaration. In 2013, I visited what remains of the concentration camp in Buchenwald, Germany, where tens of thousands of people, mainly Jews, were tortured and exterminated. While there, I bought a biography of Pastor Paul Schneider, a pastor whom the Nazis martyred there on the 18th of July, 1939. I was so moved by him that I wrote 14 blog posts about him. Schneider was born into a deeply Christian family. His grandfather, father, and uncle were pastors. He grew up in the country, in towns and in villages. He went to war for his country. He was injured. He was awarded a war medal. Schneider was pastor to a small rural parish, not to the wider world. He did not engage in ecumenism. Schneider had no political connections. He didn't engage in political action. He didn't start a movement to oppose the Nazis. He didn't display much interest in ecumenism. He just stood his ground and resisted the efforts of the state to encroach into the domain of the church. He helped the poor and supported missions. The Nazis arrested Schneider multiple times for refusing to kowtow to the state. The Nazis arrested and detained him for opposing false theology proclaimed by a Nazi leader at the funeral of a Nazi youth, for refusing to pledge that he would not read to his congregation a notice from the confessing church, for bringing under church discipline 3 Nazi members of his congregation. The Nazis arrested, detained, and murdered him for defying an exile order. The Nazis never tried or found Schneider guilty of any crime. Schneider's life and martyrdom reminds us that the church is the bride of Christ, to be readied for the groom, often at a price. We seldom hear this teaching, although it's very important. For instance, in the latter days of Chile under the dictator Pinochet, the Roman Catholic Church excommunicated members who engaged in torture, including the dictator himself. The Catholic bishops wrote, "Torturers, their accomplices, and those who are able to stop torture and do not do it cannot receive Holy Communion, nor can they morally be godparents in the sacraments of the Church." unless they sincerely repent. How I wish someone would say this to all the police who are involved in enforced disappearances in Malaysia. Now, I want to move on to speak to you about Pastor Martin Niemuller, who died in 1984, aged 92 years. One of Niemoller's poems is very famous. I'm sure you've heard the words. First, they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Niemuller was the son of a Lutheran pastor. By the end of the First World War, he was a submarine commander. When Germany lost that war, he refused an order from his superiors to surrender his submarine. Since he was such a highly decorated officer, command was transferred to another officer so that the Navy could avoid issuing Niemuller with a dishonorable discharge for insubordination. Some years later, he completed theological training and became a pastor in Lutheran church in Dahlem in Berlin. Soon after Hitler came to power in 1933, he met privately with Niemuller and two other national Christian leaders. At that meeting, Niemuller saw that Hitler was an evil, dangerous deceiver who planned to hijack the church and turn it into a servant of the state. From that time on, Niemuller began speaking and organizing against Hitler and the Nazi Party. Niemuller, Bonhoeffer, and others formed the Pastors' Emergency League. This league became the Confessing Church, which in May 1943 issued the Barmen Declaration. Niemuller was a vigorous promoter of the Barmen Declaration and the subsequent Dahlem Declaration, which was issued after a conference of national leaders in his parish in October 1934. Niemuller spoke and preached tirelessly about true and false doctrine and the importance of resisting the intrusion of the state into church affairs. A year before the Nazis arrested him, Niemuller told Christians, "We must warn the Führer that the adoration frequently bestowed on him is only due to God. His thoughts are used as a basis not only for political decisions, but also for morality and law. He himself is surrounded with the dignity of a priest. We ask that liberty be given to our people to go their way under the sign of the cross of Christ, in order that our grandsons may not curse their elders on the ground that their elders left them a state on earth that closed to them the kingdom of God." Niemuller became famous in Germany and abroad. This was too much for Hitler. In 1937, Hitler ordered the arrest of Niemuller. Niemuller then spent 7 years in detention, first in lockups and prisons, then in concentration camps, often in solitary confinement. People around the world tracked his fate. He was on the cover of Time magazine on Christmas Eve, 1944. After the Nazis released him, he said something which strikes me as very insightful. He said that before he became a prisoner of the state, he focused all his speeches on answering the question Luther had asked, how to find a merciful God. But after seeing the horrible things done by his countrymen during the war, he decided to focus all his speeches on answering the question, how to make my neighbor merciful. And he did. In other words, he committed himself to being an activist, focused on showing his neighbors a better way and persuading them to abandon their prior ways. Niemoller's faith and his time in detention led him to resolve that he must intentionally engage with others and hold his ground without causing undue offense. This is what he modeled in the rest of his life. He even became a pacifist. Niemoller's life shows us that people can and do change, that each one of us must change. Niemoller's life cries out to us, you are responsible for your neighbor. Don't give up doing good and speaking truth. Be confessional, be bold, do not be discouraged. Niemoller's life helps us see why and how governments want to dictate terms to faith groups and their leaders, and what response God expects from the faithful. Now I'll turn to the subject of status confessionis. The weapon, if I may call it that, of status confessionis was forged over 500 years ago. Bonhoeffer found it and used it in the 1930s. Then Barmen used it, and awakened Christians continue to use it. In South Africa, until April 1994, there was a system of laws which denied to blacks rights which are available to whites. The government called it apartheid for apartness. There are many examples of how apartheid impacts life. For example, they wouldn't allow blacks to live in certain areas because they were reserved for whites. Wouldn't allow blacks to hold certain jobs because they're reserved for whites. Wouldn't allow blacks to move freely because that's a freedom reserved for whites. An elaborate system was devised to provide blacks with passes to control their movements. It was a protest against passes, which resulted in the Sharpeville massacre in 1960. On that day, government forces killed or wounded 250 people. Why am I talking about South Africa when my topic is Christians under Hitler? Because many South African theologians justified or tolerated apartheid policies, just as many German theologians justified or tolerated Nazi policies. Because those who made the laws and enforced them were Christians. Because Christian theologians helped expunge apartheid, just like German theologians helped expunge Nazism. Like the Germans before them, the South Africans used the weapon of status confessionis. In 1977, the Lutheran World Federation, assembled in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, declared that the situation in Southern Africa constitutes a status confessionis that requires that the churches publicly and unequivocally reject the existing apartheid system. They cut off the Dutch church. In 1982, the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, at a global meeting in Ottawa, declared that apartheid is a sin and that the moral and theological justification of it is a travesty of the gospel, and in its persistent disobedience to the word of God, a theological heresy. On the basis of this declaration, the Alliance suspended the membership of the Afrikaans Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa. And then in 1986, the Dutch Reformed Mission Church of South Africa prepared, adopted, and published a document called the Confession of Belhar. This confession rejected any teaching which attempts to legitimate such forced separation on a racial basis by appeal to the gospel, and is not prepared to venture on the road of obedience and reconciliation, but rather out of prejudice, fear, selfishness, and unbelief, denies in advance the reconciling power of the gospel, must be considered ideology and false doctrine. Now I'll do a quick summary before I move on to the response of the Catholic Church to Hitler, since it was my article "At 3 o'clock I Must Die" which prompted you to invite me to speak to you today. The purpose of everything I've said so far is to make a strong statement. That statement is this: churches, and indeed all faith groups, must stand up to the state. We must draw lines and make it very clear to the state that if it crosses any line, we will resist. In Malaysia, we've only made pleas through statements. We've only done so on an ad hoc basis. We've done so when the authorities held up our Bibles or forbade us from using Bahasa Malaysia in Arabic, or falsely accused or abducted and disappeared our pastors. It's no good just complaining in our little groups. How can we expect the government to listen to us if we don't present a united voice? The German and South African experience tells us that we must come up with a confession for our times, a confession which will serve as a rejection of so much that is done by our government, a confession which will ensure care and justice for the poor and marginalized and keep the state out of faith groups so that we can be loyal critics of the state. A confession which every pastor in every pulpit will repeatedly proclaim and teach. Now I'll move on to the response of the Catholic Church through the story that I published a few weeks ago. I'm going to keep this part very brief. On the 21st of February 1944, after 8 months in prison, Dr. Alfons Wachsmann in Brandenburg prison in Berlin, Germany, wrote a letter to his sister Minka. Its first line reads, "At 3 o'clock I must die." Before his arrest and incarceration on the 23rd of June 1943, he had served for 15 years as parish priest and university chaplain in Greifswald. He was known for his activities in the mission for the conversion of Germany. Father Wachsmann was charged with doubting the accuracy of the figures quoted by the government to prove the success of the U-boat campaign, with not placing implicit faith in the Führer and with not being confident of German victory. In other words, he questioned the government version of some stories of so-called success in the war. So Wachsmann was one of hundreds of priests who were hauled up after a letter issued by Pope Pius XI was read in Roman Catholic churches across Germany on the 14th of February 1943, the fifth Sunday of Lent, then known as Passion Sunday. Unusually, it was in German, not Latin. The Encyclical, with the translated title "With Burning Concern," had been smuggled into Germany, secretly evading the Gestapo, the state secret service. The church printed 300,000 copies in presses across the nation. Enraged, the Nazis shut down all those presses. The Encyclical was an official denunciation by the church of the politics of Hitler and his National Socialist or Nazi party. It was a confession because it apologetically explained why the church had signed a concordat or agreement with Hitler 4 years earlier. And because Hitler did not keep his end of the bargain, the church was now breaking it. Remember this word concordat. I'll mention it again at the end of this talk. It was also a confession in that it rejected the Nazi state's policies of pantheism, racism, nationalism, and blind obedience to the Führer. It labeled the policies blasphemous, idolatrous, immoral, pagan, profane, provocative, reprehensible, and much more. It defended the Old Testament, which the Nazi-oriented Christians wanted to excise from the Bible. It defended parts of the New Testament, which the Nazis also wanted to excise. It decreed that the church founded by the Redeemer is one, the same for all races and all nations, and called on Catholics to square their faith and their conduct with the claims of the law of God and of the church. It said many other things. Priests who read the letter must have been nourished by these words. The priest's first loving gift to his neighbors is to serve truth and refute error in any of its forms. Failure on this score would be not only a betrayal of God and your vocation, but also an offense against the real welfare of your people and country. To all those who in the exercise of their priestly function are called upon to suffer persecution, to all those imprisoned in jails and concentration camps, the Father of the Christian world sends his words of gratitude and commendation. Father Wachsmann endured much hardship, from sleeplessness due to bedbugs to being in a locked cell while air raids alarms wailed, Allied bombs dropped nearby, and the glass in the windows of his cell shattered and were never replaced. From 1939 to 1943, the authorities arrested and tried hundreds of Catholic priests for oppositional activity. Dozens of their names can be found in the church list of German martyrs of the 20th century. Idolatry and justice must be resisted. Retaliation is as certain as victory. Those who've gone before us teach us what it means to follow Christ and to serve our neighbors, especially in matters of freedom of belief. We live in the dark shadow of the injustices perpetrated against Raymond Coe, Amri Chekmat, Joshua Hilmi, and Ruth Sitepu. And in the dark shadow of abuse, exploitation, and neglect, sometimes till death, of migrant workers and refugees. If we are faithful to our calling to be good neighbors, we must expect and prepare to be victims of abuse of power by the state. We must consider whether we have, perhaps unwittingly, made a concordat with the state. We must consider whether we must break that concordat with the status confessionis. We, like Niemoller, must work on making our neighbors merciful. We must speak words of judgment and do deeds of love. For Jesus himself is our peace, who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility. Thank you for your patient attention.